The wind came hard that morning, sharp as the edge of a broken bottle, carrying with it the smell of dust, sage, and the faint sweetness of wild prairie grass. Clara Hartley stood by the window of her small rented room in St. Louis, clutching a wrinkled envelope she had read too many times already. The postmark said, Dry Creek, Montana Territory. Inside, the words were simple, written in a rough, uncertain hand, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who worked more with horses than with paper. Dear Miss Hartley, I seen your notice in the Gazette about looking for a good man with land. I got both and I got a need. My wife's been gone these 2 years. Left behind a little girl who needs a mother's touch. If you still aim to come west, I'll meet the stage myself. Yours, Thomas Wade. She'd read that closing line again and again, tracing the T with her finger. Thomas Wade, a name as plain and strong as the land he must have worked. Clara wasn't sure what scared her more, the thought of marrying a stranger, or the thought of staying where she was. The boarding house downstairs was filled with coughing men, hungry children, and women like her, widows, seamstresses, dreamers whose dreams had grown thin as the sheets they washed. Life in the East had given her little but grief. Her husband had died in the war, her savings had gone to doctor's bills, and the world had grown too small for her pain. But the West meant that wild, endless promise and whispered of second chances, so she packed her trunk with the last of her belongings, her mother's locket, one Sunday dress, and a book of psalms so worn the cover was almost gone. She looked once more around her room, took a deep breath, and folded Thomas Wade's letter neatly into her coat pocket. As she left, the landlady watched her from the doorway.
Headed west, are you?
The old woman rasped. Yes, ma'am, Clara answered softly. Ain't nothing out there but hard men and harder winters, the woman said. Clara smiled faintly. Then maybe I'll fit right in. 3 weeks later, the stagecoach rattled through the last stretch of open country. Endless fields rolled by, brown, gold, alive with wind. The horizon looked like a promise written in fire. Clara pressed her face to the glass, heart pounding in rhythm with the wheels. The other passengers were mostly silent. A preacher bound for Bozeman, a salesman who never stopped talking, and a farmer's boy returning home from a failed attempt at city life. But Clara hardly noticed them. She was thinking of what she would say when she finally saw Thomas Wade. The driver shouted as they neared Dry Creek. The town wasn't much. A cluster of buildings huddled around a dusty street, a saloon with swinging doors, a church with a leaning steeple, and a handful of wooden homes stretching toward the plains. Waiting by the hitching post stood a tall man, broad-shouldered and sunburned, hat pulled low against the glare. Beside him, clutching a rag doll, was a small girl with golden hair and eyes too old for her years. When Clara stepped down from the coach, Thomas took off his hat. Miss Hartley? He asked, voice deep and quiet. She nodded, too nervous to trust her tongue. This here's my daughter, Emma. The little girl looked up, curious but wary. Are you going to be my new mama? Clara knelt down, smiling gently. If you'll have me. Emma studied her for a long moment, then slipped her small hand into Clara's. You smell like flowers, she whispered. Thomas watched the exchange with something unreadable in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe. Or fear. It's a long ride to the ranch, he said finally. Hope you're not scared of horses. Not of horses, she replied softly. Just of the unknown. He gave a half smile. Then you'll fit right in here. The sun sank low as they rode out of town, the land glowing copper and red. Miles of open prairie stretched ahead, the wind humming through the tall grass like an old song. Clara held tight to the reins, glancing occasionally at Thomas. Silent, steady, strong. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. She learned that he'd fought to keep his ranch alive through drought and debt, that his wife had died of fever, and that he'd been raising Emma alone ever since. A man can mend fences and break horses, he said at one point, but he can't fill a child's silence. Something in his voice broke her heart. By the time they reached the homestead, a small but proud cabin framed by hills and cottonwoods, the stars had begun to show. Clara climbed down stiffly, her dress dusty, her spirit trembling somewhere between hope and exhaustion. The house smelled of pine, smoke, and loneliness. A single picture hung on the wall, a woman with kind eyes smiling faintly. Clara looked at it, feeling both welcomed and judged. That's Mary, Thomas said quietly behind her. Emma's ma. She was beautiful, Clara said. He nodded once. She was. The silence that followed was heavy but not cruel. Emma ran off to chase the old dog that came bounding from the porch, and Thomas stood by the hearth, lighting the fire. "It ain't much," he said, looking around the one-room home. "But it's warm, and it's honest." Clara set her trunk down by the wall. "Honest is more than I've had in a long time." For the first time that night, Thomas looked at her. Really looked. Not as a mail-order bride, not as a stranger, but as a woman standing in the same storm he'd lived through, and something unspoken passed between them. A fragile truce, or maybe the beginning of something neither dared to name. Outside, the coyotes began to sing. Inside, the fire caught, throwing gold light across their faces, and in that moment, Clara realized she hadn't just come west for a husband, she'd come for a home. The first snow came early that year, drifting across the plains like white ghosts. Clara woke to the soft creak of the windmill and the faint cry of a rooster that sounded more tired than proud. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The cabin was cold, the kind of cold that bit the skin and found its way into the bones. She crossed to the stove and fed it with kindling until the fire began to grow, orange light spreading across the rough wooden floor. The walls shuddered with each gust of wind. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, a gray weight pressing down on the land. Emma stirred from her cot and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is it morning already?" she murmured. "It is, sweetheart," Clara said, her voice gentle. "Stay wrapped up a bit longer. The fire's still waking up too." Thomas was already outside. She could hear the faint crunch of his boots in the snow. He'd been up before dawn, as he always was. She watched through the frosted window as he crossed the yard, leading 2 horses to the barn. The man moved like the land itself, quiet, steady, deliberate. Every motion spoke of a life built on endurance. Clara watched him longer than she meant to. Something about his stillness comforted her, but it also made her ache. Breakfast was quiet. Thomas ate with his usual efficiency. Eyes lowered, shoulders square. Emma chattered about the snow, about how she hoped it would pile high enough to build a fort. Clara smiled and nodded along, happy to hear the child's laughter fill the air. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was low. "Storm's rolling in tonight. Might be a hard one." Clara looked up. "Should we be worried?" He shook his head. "Not if we're careful. I'll make sure the animals are in and the woodpile's full. You just keep the fire going." She nodded, but there was a flicker of fear deep inside her. Storms had always frightened her. The sound of the wind howling like a wounded thing. The feeling of being trapped by something bigger than any man could fight. But this time she wasn't alone. After breakfast, she bundled Emma in shawls and boots and helped her out to the yard to feed the chickens. The air was sharp and bright, every breath a bite of winter. The horizon stretched endless, white and blinding. The world reduced to cold and silence. Emma giggled as the hens pecked around her feet. "They don't even care it's snowing," she said. Clara smiled. "They're braver than most of us." "You're brave," Emma said suddenly, her little voice serious. "Papa said you came all the way from Missouri by yourself." Clara paused, kneeling to tie the girl's scarf tighter. "Sometimes being brave just means you keep going when you're scared." Emma looked thoughtful. "Then Papa's brave too." "He is," Clara said softly, glancing toward the barn. "He surely is." That evening the storm came. It started with whispers. A restless wind against the windows, a single snowflake melting on the sill. Then came the roar, wild and full of fury. The house groaned under the weight of it. Thomas came in from the barn, coat-soaked, face raw from the cold. Clara rushed to help him pull off his gloves. His hands were rough, red, trembling from the cold. She took them gently in hers and rubbed until color returned. "You'll freeze yourself," she scolded softly. He looked down at her hands on his, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "Not if you're here to thaw me out." The words caught her by surprise. They weren't flirtation, not really. They came from somewhere deeper, lonelier, a truth that had lived too long without warmth. Emma sat by the fire with her doll, humming a little tune. Clara busied herself with supper. Though her heart wasn't steady, she could feel Thomas's eyes on her sometimes, not in lust but in curiosity, as though he was trying to understand the kind of woman who'd ride halfway across the country to mend another man's home. When they ate, the storm howled outside, drowning the world in white noise. Every creak of the roof sounded like a cry. Clara kept her voice light, asking Thomas about the land, how far his field stretched, how long he'd been ranching. He answered in short, thoughtful bursts, his deep voice like gravel and honey. Mary used to say the prairie had its own moods, he said finally. One day gentle, the next mean as a cornered wolf. But she loved it anyway. Said it made her feel alive. Clara nodded. I can understand that. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. And something passed between them. Not desire, not yet. Something quieter, the kind of understanding that lives in silence. The storm worsened through the night. Snow piled against the door. The windows rattled like angry bones. Emma crawled into Clara's bed, trembling. Clara held her close, humming softly, feeling the child's small heart beating against her arm. In the other corner, Thomas sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. After a while, he spoke. Mary used to sing when it stormed, he said, voice low. Said it kept the darkness from feeling so big. She sounds like she was kind, Clara whispered. She was, he said, and strong, stronger than I ever was. Clara shifted, watching the firelight play across his face. She saw the grief there, old but still alive, and beneath it something else. Hope, maybe, or the fear of it. You're strong too, she said quietly. You just don't know it anymore. He looked at her then, really looked. Not as a stranger, not as a replacement, but as a woman standing beside him in the same long storm. For a moment, the air between them seemed to hum. The wind screamed outside. The fire cracked, and yet the silence between them felt louder than all of it. Finally, Thomas nodded once, almost to himself. You're a brave woman, Clara Hartley, he said softly. So are you. Thomas Wade, she whispered back. And somewhere in the night, as the storm raged on and the fire burned low, something fragile and beautiful began to take root. The first warmth of a love neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a world wrapped in silence. Snow stretched unbroken in every direction, glittering like 1,000 diamonds in the weak light of dawn. The air was sharp still, almost holy. Clara stood in the doorway, the hem of her dress brushing the threshold, watching the slow swirl of mist rising from the frozen fields. For a long moment, she didn't move. The quiet pressed against her, deep and pure, the kind of silence that feels like a prayer. Inside, Emma's soft laughter filled the small cabin as she played with her doll by the fire. The sound warmed Clara more than the heat of the stove ever could. Behind her, Thomas stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching lightly in the snow. He'd shaved that morning, and the clean, rough scent of soap and pine drifted between them. He didn't speak at first, just followed her gaze out across the whitened land. Beautiful, ain't it? He said finally. She nodded. It is. But it looks lonely too. Most beautiful things are, he said quietly. The words settled between them. Soft as falling snow. Thomas leaned against one of the porch posts, watching his horses in the distance, their breath steaming in the cold. The river will be frozen near solid by now, he said. Means we'll have to haul water from the well till thaw. You've been through winters like this before, Clara said. He nodded. Too many. But this one feels different. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Different how? He hesitated as though the words cost him something. It's not just me and Emma this time. His tone was simple, almost matter-of-fact, but the meaning beneath it made Clara's heart stumble. She looked down at her gloved hands, hiding the smile that tugged at her mouth. Later that day, while Thomas worked on the fences and cleared the roof of snow, Clara tended the home. She scrubbed, baked, and mended, her fingers moving with the kind of quiet purpose that only comes when a heart is trying to heal. Emma followed her everywhere, curious, talkative, endlessly full of questions. Did you have a little girl back in St. Louis? She asked suddenly as Clara kneaded dough. Clara paused, pressing her hands into the flour a moment longer than needed. No, sweetheart. I never did. Did you want one? Clara smiled softly, her throat tight. More than anything. Emma beamed. Then I'm glad you found me. That simple sentence undid something deep inside her. Clara had come west searching for survival, for safety, but what she'd found instead was belonging. Fragile, uncertain, but real. As dusk crept across the plains, Thomas returned from the barn. Snow clung to his coat and beard, and his breath came out in clouds. Clara met him at the door, holding a towel. You'll catch your death out there, she said. Been courting death since I bought this land. He replied with a weary grin. She helped him out of his coat, her hands brushing the fabric near his shoulders. Her fingertips grazed the edge of a long, puckered scar that disappeared beneath his shirt. She froze, her breath catching. He saw the look in her eyes and turned slightly away. Got that 2 winters ago, he said roughly. A stallion kicked loose during a storm. Near tore my ribs apart. Clara's voice softened. Does it still hurt? He met her gaze, and for the first time something raw and unguarded flickered there. Only when it's cold. Or when I think too long about the past. Her hand rose before she could stop it. She touched the edge of the scar, gentle as a whisper. His breath hitched. Time seemed to fold inward, the world narrowing to that single point of contact. Her hand, his skin, the firelight trembling between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "You survived." "Barely," he said, "but sometimes barely's enough." He turned to face her fully. The fire painted his features in shades of gold and shadow. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. Longing, fear, or both. "Clara," he began, his voice low and rough. But whatever he meant to say fell away. Because just then Emma's laughter burst through the silence, calling out for her papa to come see the cookies she'd made. The spell broke. Clara stepped back, cheeks burning, and turned toward the table. Thomas watched her for a long moment before joining his daughter by the hearth. That night, when the world was still again, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind hum softly through the cracks in the cabin walls. Her heart wouldn't calm. It kept returning to that moment by the fire. His warmth, his breath. The way he'd looked at her like he'd seen a ghost of something he thought long buried. She rose quietly, wrapping herself in her shawl, and stepped outside. The moon hung low, silver over the snow. It was the kind of night that made a person feel small, and yet somehow infinite. After a few minutes, she heard boots crunching behind her. "Couldn't sleep either?" Thomas's voice came low and careful. She smiled faintly. "No, it's too quiet." He stepped beside her, hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold. For a long time they stood in silence, staring out over the moonlit field. Finally he said, "Mary used to stand out here too. Said the night air made her feel close to God." Clara glanced at him, the sadness in his voice soft and real. "And what about you, Thomas? What makes you feel close to God?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "Right now," he said finally, "it's this." And before Clara could speak, he turned to her, slow, hesitant, as though unsure if he had the right, and brushed his lips against hers. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of truth. A kiss that said, "I'm still here. I'm still alive." The world seemed to stop, and the wind, the cold, even her heartbeat. When he pulled back, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Don't be sorry." He searched her face, the moonlight catching the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You deserve better than a broken man," he murmured. "Maybe," she said softly. "But maybe a broken man's the only kind who can understand a broken woman." He looked at her for a long moment, something breaking and mending inside him all at once. And though neither spoke again that night, they stood together in the cold until the moon sank behind the hills. Two souls bound not by promises or vows, but by the quiet, trembling hope of beginning again. The winter deepened, tightening its grip on the land until even the rivers seemed to give up their fight. The snow no longer sparkled like diamonds. It had turned cruel, hard, crusted with ice that cut through boots and skin alike. Each morning began with the crack of frost-splitting wood, and each night ended with the howl of something wild beyond the tree line. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the barn door, the smell of hay and smoke, the warmth of the stove that never seemed to burn hot enough. But the routine did not dull the ache inside her. Every time Thomas brushed past her, every time his hand lingered near hers, something inside her stirred, a mixture of fear, yearning, and something close to joy. She told herself she didn't need love. She'd come west for safety, not for a heart to lose. But love, like the wind, crept in where walls cracked, unseen, unstoppable. One morning, the sky carried that heavy stillness that warned of trouble. Thomas stood by the corral, studying the horizon. Clara watched him from the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. His posture was tense, alert. "What is it?" she called. He didn't look back. "Tracks." Her stomach tightened. "Wolves." He shook his head. "No, horses." That word changed everything. Within minutes, Thomas saddled up, his face carved in steel. Clara had seen that look only once before, The day the storm nearly took his life when he'd fought to save his cattle in the blinding snow. It was the look of a man ready to face death if he had to. "Thomas, please," she said, stepping closer. "Don't go alone." He paused long enough to meet her eyes. "Someone's been rustling stock up north. 3 ranches hit in 2 weeks. If they're near us, I need to know. Then let me send for help," she insisted. The sheriff's half a day away. By the time he gets here, they'll be gone." Emma came running from the cabin, her hair wild, clutching her doll. "Papa, don't go," she cried. Thomas crouched and gathered her in his arms. The sight tore at Clara. The way his broad hands looked so gentle against the small frame of his daughter. "I'll be back before supper," he said softly. "You be good for Clara, you hear?" Emma's voice trembled. "Promise?" He smiled faintly. "Cross my heart." But promises made under gray skies are often broken by the night. The hours stretched thin. Clara tried to keep busy, chopping vegetables, sweeping the hearth, anything to keep her hands from shaking. The wind picked up again, whispering against the windows like a warning. Emma sat by the fire, her small fingers working on the doll's hair. "He'll come back soon, won't he?" the girl asked. Clara forced a smile. "Of course he will." But when the light began to fade and the snow started again, her confidence faltered. The sound came just after sunset, the distant echo of hooves, fast and desperate. Clara rushed to the door, heart pounding. A single horse emerged from the dark, rider slumped low in the saddle. "Thomas!" she screamed. He barely managed to dismount before collapsing into the snow. Clara was there in an instant, falling to her knees beside him. His coat was torn, his sleeves soaked in blood. "Lord, no," she whispered. "Thomas, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, glassy and pained. They took the herd," he rasped. 3 men ambushed me by the ridge. One caught me in the arm before I could draw. Clara pressed her hands against the wound, feeling the hot rush of blood between her fingers. "You're safe now," she said, more to convince herself than him. "You're home." Emma was crying behind her, clutching Clara's skirt. The child's sobs tore through the night. "Papa, please wake up," she cried. Thomas's breath hitched. Don't let her see," he managed. "Hush," Clara whispered fiercely. "You're not dying. Not tonight." She dragged him inside, half carrying, half pulling, her skirts trailing blood through the snow. She laid him on the bed, tore open his shirt, and went to work. Cleaning, binding, praying under her breath. Every move was steady, though her heart thundered in her chest. When the bleeding slowed, he opened his eyes again. "You should have gone east," he murmured weakly. "You don't belong in this kind of life." She met his gaze, tears spilling freely now. "Then tell me, Thomas Wade, what kind of life do I belong in if not the one where you are?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then with what little strength he had, he reached up and touched her face. His hand trembled. "God help me," he whispered. "I never wanted to love again." Her breath caught. She leaned closer, resting her forehead against his. "Then don't fight it," she said softly. "Just stay." The hours that followed were a blur of firelight and fear. Clara sat beside him through the night, holding his hand, listening to the faint rattle of his breath. She didn't sleep, didn't dare. Every flicker of his eyelids, every groan, every heartbeat felt like a victory. At one point he stirred, his voice rough and low. "You saved my life," he whispered. She shook her head, tears glinting. "No, you saved mine the moment you wrote that letter." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that looked like a prayer answered too late. And as the dawn crept in, pale and cold, she realized she loved him not because he was strong, or brave or handsome, but because he was human, because he hurt, because he tried. When his fever broke, he slept deeply, his breathing finally even. Clara slumped against the wall, exhausted, but she didn't move her hand from his. She held it until the morning light touched their faces. Outside, the blood in the snow had frozen black. The tracks leading away from the ranch told a story unfinished, but for now Thomas was alive, and that was enough. The thaw came late that spring, slow and reluctant, as if the earth itself was unsure whether it was ready to breathe again. Ice still clung stubbornly to the riverbanks, and the mountains wore their white crowns long after the valley had turned to mud. Life crept back in small, hesitant ways, a bird call in the distance, the first buds on the cottonwoods, the smell of damp soil rising from the ground. Clara stood outside the cabin, the morning sun touching her hair, the world waking around her. She looked across the field toward the barn, where Thomas was leaning against a fence post, his arm still bound but healing. He looked thinner now, worn down by both pain and restless nights, but alive. It had been weeks since the ambush, weeks of tending to his wounds, of sleepless nights filled with whispered prayers and quiet fear. Clara had learned to read the smallest signs in him, the tightening of his jaw when he tried to hide the pain, the way his eyes softened when Emma sat on his knee, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She'd told herself their kiss under the moon had been a mistake, a comfort born of loneliness and fear. But the truth was that every time their eyes met, that moment returned to her, fierce and alive like a brand that refused to fade. The rustlers had not been caught. 3 men, maybe more, were still roaming the territory, preying on isolated ranches and travelers. Word had spread through the nearby towns that there was a bounty on their heads now, $1,000 dead or alive. Thomas could barely ride yet, but he was already thinking of revenge. "They took near half my herd," he said one evening, staring into the fire. "Killed 2 of my steers for meat and left the rest to wander. I can't let that stand." Clara, seated across from him mending a torn shirt, looked up sharply. "You can't go after them," she said. "Not like this. You're still weak." "I'm strong enough," he muttered. She set her needle down. "Strong enough to get yourself killed, maybe." His head lifted, eyes meeting hers, eyes full of stubborn pride and wounded fury. "You don't understand, Clara. A man's land is his life out here. If I let them take it without a fight, I ain't worth the dirt I stand on." "You're worth more than land," she said softly, "more than pride." He looked at her for a long moment, something in him wavering. Then his voice softened, rough as gravel. "I can't let them think I'm a man who won't defend what's his." Her heart twisted at the word his. Did that include her now? Did he see her as part of what he meant to protect? She wanted to ask God how she wanted to, but the words caught in her throat. The next day, Thomas saddled his horse. Clara came out to the yard, the cold morning wind tugging at her shawl. "You're leaving," she said, her voice barely steady. He nodded once. "Heading to Dry Creek. I'll meet with the sheriff, see what he knows." She stepped closer, her hands gripping the edge of her shawl until her knuckles went white. "And if you find them?" His jaw clenched. "Then they'll answer for what they've done. And if they kill you?" He looked down at her. That long, steady look that always made her feel seen and exposed all at once. "Then you'll bury me under that cottonwood behind the barn. It's good soil there." The casual way he said it broke something inside her. She reached out, catching his sleeve. "Don't you dare talk like that, Thomas Wade." He turned to her fully now. She saw the pain in his face, not fear, but the quiet acceptance of a man who'd already lived too close to death. "You think I want to go?" he said quietly. "I'd give everything I own to stay here with you and Emma. But if I don't end this, it'll come back. Men like that don't stop. They'll take from others, maybe worse. And I can't live knowing I let that happen." Her eyes filled. "So you'll go even knowing what it'll cost." He reached up then, slowly, gently, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You saved my life once," he said. "Don't make me feel like I wasted the chance." His voice was so soft, so full of something that hurt to hear that she couldn't speak. All she could do was nod. "Bring him back," she whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to Emma, who stood clutching her doll on the porch. "You bring her father back to me." "I'll try," he said, and for a moment the mask of the hardened rancher slipped, revealing the man beneath, the man who had lost too much and loved too deeply to stop fighting. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode out into the cold dawn. The snow still held patches of blood from that terrible night. She watched until he vanished beyond the ridge. The days that followed were slow torture. Clara moved through the motions of work like a ghost, feeding the animals, stoking the fire, helping Emma with her reading. But her thoughts were always miles away, chasing the echo of hoofbeats. Every sound outside made her heart leap. Every sunset brought new dread. One evening, as the last light slipped over the horizon, she saw a rider coming fast down the valley trail. Her heart leapt to her throat. "Emma," she whispered, "go inside." The horse thundered closer, too fast, too wild. When it stopped, she saw at once that it wasn't Thomas. It was the deputy from Dry Creek, his face grim, dust clinging to his coat. "Mrs. Wade?" he asked. "Miss Hartley," she corrected automatically, her voice trembling. "Where's Thomas?" The man looked down, eyes shadowed. There was a shootout by the ridge. 3 men dead. The 4th escaped, her breath caught. "And Thomas?" "He was hit," the deputy said slowly. "But he's alive." They've got him laid up at the way station outside town. He told me to tell you not to worry." She didn't wait another second. She threw on her coat, grabbed Emma's hand, and ran for the barn. By nightfall, she reached the way station, a small, weathered building lit by lamplight. When she stepped inside, the smell of whiskey, gunpowder, and blood hit her at once. Thomas lay on a cot near the fire, his face pale, his shirt torn and stained. "You fool," she whispered, rushing to his side. "You said you'd be careful." He opened his eyes, a weak grin tugging at his mouth. "Careful wasn't on the menu, I reckon." She sank to her knees beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. "I told you not to go." "And if I hadn't," he murmured, "those men would still be out there. Now they're gone." His fingers brushed her cheek. "You shouldn't have come. And you shouldn't have made me love you," she whispered, voice breaking. "But we both did things we shouldn't." He smiled then, the kind of smile that held both sorrow and peace. "Guess we're both guilty then." She leaned down and kissed him, slow and trembling, tasting salt and ash and relief. For the first time, she didn't hold back. There was no fear left, only the truth that had been burning inside her since the first night she saw him. And for a moment, the world outside, the cold, the danger, the death, faded away. There was only them, and the warmth between two broken souls who had found each other against all odds. The snow was gone by the time Thomas Wade could walk without pain. Spring had come at last, soft and hesitant, breathing color back into the land that winter had nearly claimed. Green shoots pushed through the thawed soil. The river sang again, and the prairie wind carried the scent of lilac and dust. For the first time in many months, the sky looked kind. Clara sat on the porch one morning, mending a torn quilt, the sun warm against her shoulders. Emma played nearby, her laughter floating through the air like a hymn. Thomas stood by the barn, repairing a broken fence post, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, his scarred arm strong and sure once more. She watched him quietly, her heart a tangle of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that he'd survived, fear that life might still find some cruel way to take him from her. But even that fear felt different now, softer somehow, because she finally understood that love wasn't about safety. It was about staying, even when the storms came, even when the wind tore at everything you built. Thomas caught her looking. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face, not the guarded one he used to wear, but something warmer, freer. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward her, his boots stirring the dust. "You keep staring at me like that, Miss Hartley," he said with a grin. "And I might start thinking you like what you see." She set her sewing aside and smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." He leaned against the porch rail, the sunlight turning his hair to gold. "You never were much for hiding your truth, were you?" "No," she said softly. "Life's too short for that." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them hummed with all the words they hadn't said, the pain they'd shared, the near misses, the long nights spent watching over one another. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath and said, "Clara, I've been thinking a lot since that night by the river." She looked up at him, her heart already quickening. "I almost lost everything out there," he continued. "And lying on that cot half dead, all I could think about was you. The way you looked that first night by the fire, the way you held Emma like she was your own, the way you made this old cabin feel like home again." His voice wavered slightly, rough with emotion. "I spent 2 years trying not to love again, too afraid, too guilty, too broken. But you walked in here with your quiet voice and your stubborn heart, and you changed everything." Her eyes shimmered. "Thomas." He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the warmth of him. "I ain't a man for fancy words. I can't offer you riches or comfort. Just this land, this life, and what's left of me." His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring. "But if you'll have it, I'd like to give you my name, and what little heart I've got left." The breath left Clara's lungs. She pressed her hand over her mouth, tears already spilling down her cheeks. "You're sure?" she whispered. "I've never been sure of anything," he said. "The bed's been cold long enough. The house needs a wife, and Emma, well, she already calls you Mama when she thinks I ain't listening." That broke her completely. She rose, her hands shaking, and before he could say another word, she wrapped her arms around him and held on tight. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "Yes, Thomas Wade. I'll marry you." The wedding was small, but the day was perfect. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree behind the barn, the one Thomas had told her to bury him under, back when he thought he might never heal. Instead, It became the place where they began again. The preacher from Dry Creek came up the trail that morning, riding an old mule and carrying a Bible so worn it looked ready to fall apart. Emma wore a wreath of wildflowers and danced barefoot in the grass. Clara's dress was plain, but she'd stitched it herself with trembling hands, each seam a prayer. Thomas wore his cleanest shirt, his hair slicked back and his eyes full of quiet awe. The vows were simple, no grand declarations, no flowery speeches, just two people who had survived too much to take promises lightly. "Do you, Thomas Wade, take this woman to be your wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," he said, his deep voice steady. "And do you, Clara Hartley, take this man to be your husband?" She looked up at Thomas, her voice trembling as she said, "I do." The preacher smiled. "Then by the grace of God and the eyes of heaven, I pronounce you man and wife." The moment his words fell away, Thomas pulled Clara close and kissed her. Not like the hesitant kiss under the moon. Not like the one by the fire when death hung between them. This kiss was full of life. Fierce, certain, eternal. Emma cheered, clapping her hands and spinning in the grass. The dog barked. The wind sighed through the cottonwood leaves, and for the first time in years, laughter filled the Wade Ranch. As the sun sank behind the hills, the land glowed gold and red. Clara sat beside Thomas on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder. Emma slept inside, curled up under the quilt they'd finished together. "You ever think we'd get here?" she asked softly. Thomas chuckled. "Honestly, I didn't think I'd live long enough to see spring again." She smiled, her fingers brushing his. "Then maybe God decided you'd suffered enough. Maybe he decided to send me an angel to remind me how to live." She laughed quietly. "Angel, am I? I think I've been too sharp-tongued for that." He turned his head and kissed her temple. "You're my kind of angel, then." They sat in silence after that, the stars waking one by one above them. The night was soft, warm, alive with the hum of crickets and the far-off call of a coyote. The fire from the hearth flickered behind them, casting its gentle light through the window. The same fire that had once kept them alive through the coldest nights. "Thomas," she whispered after a long while. "You said the land is a man's life." "I did." "Then what's a woman's?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and kind. "Whatever she decides it to be. But if she's lucky, it's the same as a man's. Love and a home and someone worth holding on to when the wind blows hard." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then I reckon I'm the luckiest woman in the West." He kissed her hand, slow and reverent, and whispered, "And I'm the luckiest fool to ever build a life out of broken pieces." The wind shifted, warm and sweet, rustling the cottonwood leaves above them. The stars seemed to shine brighter, and the night wrapped around them like a blessing. The farmer who had once lived alone now had a wife, a child, and a home filled with laughter instead of echoes. And the woman who had crossed half a country for a chance at survival had found something far greater. A man who saw her not as a savior, nor a stranger, but as his heart's rest. Beneath the cottonwood, the land slept peacefully, and in the quiet cabin under the endless sky, two souls, weary, mended, and forever changed.